may be moving away from being kind of an acceptable argument now, which it can be from time to time. But really, I think we're looking at, well, we need to ensure that in taking all those steps, all those reasonable steps, is it appropriate to have a culture that allows industrial language or banter or things like that? And that's not to say that we can't have fun at work, but I think there's quite a clear line to be drawn. And obviously, when we're looking at kind of the sexual harassment side of things, there can be a real issue there. And again, you know, not to sound a bit like a broken record, but when we're talking about risk assessments, they can't be a one-off exercise. And I think it's really important that if we are risk assessing our business properly, what we are doing is having a review period. So whether that's every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, it will depend on the nature of the business. I think 6 months is a pretty good starting point, but we'll see what the EHRC guidance and what the kind of case law is saying when we get to that point. But as a starting point, I'd say unless the business calls for it because of the nature of the business, I would suggest 6 months at a minimum. Or if there's any big change, I suppose, within the business. So if we take on a to-pay transfer and make an acquisition and we've got something different going on, I think we need to be looking at it at that stage. Again, it's not about having a risk assessment on paper. It's about understanding where those real risks are and using those risks to shape what we do in practice to take all reasonable steps. I touched previously on third-party harassment. This is where it gets quite difficult in practice because ultimately we're being asked to manage risks that we don't have full control of. You know, when we've got customers, clients, contractors, all these kinds of third parties, we can't control their behaviour in the same way we can our own employees. You know, we can't discipline a client. We can't, you know, give a customer a first written warning. But under the kind of all reasonable steps duty, that's not going to be an answer on its own. Again, it's about anticipating the risks that exist and taking those reasonable steps to reduce it. So, you know, I think the starting point for those kinds of exposure points are roles with a lot of customer interaction, roles on client sites or off-site, or sort of lone working situations or lone working situations involving third parties. And the question becomes, well, what could we reasonably do to protect our staff in those circumstances? And I think, you know, again, we're going to have to look at that on an individual case-by-case basis, but as a few kind of practical ideas to think about, I think it's setting clear expectations with third parties. So if we are using a contractor, making them aware that we have a kind of zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment or our policy or anything like that. Giving staff guidance and training on how to deal with that inappropriate behaviour, what to do, who they can report it to, and what we'll do if they do report it. Again, putting in place safeguards. So can we avoid lone working and high risk situations? Are there things that we can do around that to make it more safe and secure for staff? And again, manager training is at the core of that, making sure that managers are equipped to deal with complaints if they do come in, and making sure they take it seriously. So even if it's from a client or a customer, it's not being kind of brushed off because, oh well, what can we do about it? We might not be able to do something about it in that first instance, but what can we do about it to prevent it going forward is the bigger question. And I think a big part of that is being prepared to act on those policies and principles. You know, it might even mean having challenging conversations with suppliers, third parties, clients, where necessary. You know, I think there's a particular commercial tension between that, because ultimately we're then having to possibly push back or you know, get into a bit of a back and forth with a client or a customer. But that's kind of the point of the duty. It expects businesses to prioritise the safety of their staff, even when that's an uncomfortable situation for us to deal with. And again, the key takeaway on that third party point is not that we have to remove the risk. We can't remove the risk entirely a lot of times. But we have to show that we've thought about it, and we have to show that we've taken all those reasonable steps to manage it as best we can. That then takes us on to how do we show that we've done enough? How do we prove that we've taken all reasonable steps in practice? And really, I think we've touched on a lot of that in the context of, well, carrying out those risk assessments, having training records of who's been trained, what did the training cover, all those things. I think that the big question to ask, and again, we have to be a little bit introspective here, is to look at our business and say, if a tribunal looked at this, what evidence could we show? So again, we could show a risk assessment and we could show how often we review those and how often we sort of reassess. We could show those training records, details of the training we've had. Again, policies, not just that we have policies and they exist, but they've been up to date, they've been updated, we've reviewed them, we've considered them in line with the business. We don't have an off-the-shelf one that we've had since 2018 and it's still the same one. While it's not as big a defence, how have we responded to any issues that we've had? What have we done when we've had complaints? Now, that doesn't sort of absolve us if someone's made a sexual harassment complaint and then we've dismissed the person who did it, because we still have to have show that we had taken all reasonable steps to prevent it in the first place. But taking deliberate and kind of direct action on those kinds of complaints will demonstrate any future, or in respect of any future issues that we have, that we do take it seriously as a business and there's not that kind of culture of banter or harassment or whatever there may be. And again, I think monitoring things, having a record of analysing trends, looking at where complaints are, looking at what action we're taking to minimise, reduce, deal with any kinds of risks or complaints that we have, is going to be invaluable in trying to defend any sexual harassment complaints that we might receive. I mean, ultimately, the key kind of takeaway of that is it can't just exist on paper. It needs to reflect what we're actually doing as a business and how we're addressing things as a business. I think one of the biggest risks is that we often have quite good looking professional documents, but they don't really match reality. And I think that, well, sometimes, there are certain parts of a handbook or something like that, okay, well, we don't really stick to that and we're not that strict on it. When it comes to something like this that forms part of our defence to a sexual harassment claim, I think it's totally invaluable to make sure that we are updating this and that is a living document that's reflecting the business. And again, it's about being consistent with this and making sure that we are applying things on a regular basis, updating things on a regular basis, so that we're in line with how our business is moving, what is changing. And I touched earlier on about if we made a new acquisition, things like that are going to be, I think, really key, especially if they are different to what we currently do, or if we're bringing a new kind of culture almost into ours. And how do we bring new employees in from a different area and make sure that they're aware of what our business expects? And again, it goes back to that training and making sure that everyone knows and understands the policy. And I think that's quite a big factor as well, because there are a lot of businesses who will send out a company handbook and have an employee sign to return and say they've read it. Now, I've seen company handbooks that are 300 pages long, and I don't believe that every employee is reading that handbook when they get it. But I think specifically we want to draw people's attention to the sexual harassment policy, and I think that can be achieved through early training when someone joins the business. So as part of an induction, having that bespoke, detailed training about how our business operates, this is what our business says about sexual harassment, this is our policy, and this is the approach we take to it. I think that the direction of travel of all this is very clear. We can't be looking at just having a single policy or a one-off training session going forward. We as employers need to have an active evidence-based approach in preventing sexual harassment and targeting the areas in which we see issues arising. The change in October is effectively a one-word change, adding the word all in, but I don't think it's a small change by any means, and I think it's going to be a really big trip hazard for a lot of employers going forward in taking all reasonable steps. I think the best thing that we can all do is look at making sure that we are kind of living, breathing our policies and our training around sexual harassment to ensure that we don't fall foul of the sort of change that we're seeing here. I think the kind of best way to think about it is think of it as a shift from reacting to issues whilst having a kind of defence in your pockets to actively preventing them, and being able to evidence that we're actively preventing sexual harassment from occurring. And that's all for me. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Calum. That was really, really useful. I think some really good practical tips in there. We're 18 months down the line, aren't we, since the changes for employers to make proactive, steps, reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. And I think a lot of companies are still just operating sexual harassment policies and training. And I think what you're demonstrating there, particularly with the changes coming in October, is that isn't going to be enough. I made quite a few notes through that. I think particularly your points around making sure that any steps that employers take are tailored to the business is really important. So they're not just off the shelf policies, they do look at specific risks. I'm not sure everybody appreciates the risk assessments, how far they have to go. You gave some really good examples of things that should be included in that, which is travel, socials. As you mentioned the Christmas party point, but any socials, relationships, lone working, contractors when we move into the third party side of it, banter, culture. I think you really spot on saying that it has to be a top-down culture that potentially needs to be addressed sometimes. There's a lot to think about, and I think we don't know yet what will happen with the very small change of adding a 3-letter word of all. But you're right, it's going to be a huge impact, and the closest thing I can think of is duty to make reasonable adjustments in a disability context.
Yeah.
And you can make 9 adjustments, but if a tribunal found there was a 10th that you should have made and you didn't, you'll lose your claim. So it sort of remains to be seen what this little all being added will mean, but it's clearly demonstrating that a lot more is expected of employers than we've traditionally seen. And the other thing you and I were talking about before, Calum, another thing, we imagine the direction of travel is that this type of proactive steps in respect of harassment will, in time, cover all areas of harassment. So risk assessments won't purely be for sexual harassment, but they could be for harassment based on other types of protected characteristics. I think that has to be the way that it's headed, and I think that is what's been hinted at by the current government. So really interesting, lots to think about. I think some really helpful practical tips there. I don't think we have any questions currently. Just we go back, check. Yeah, no questions. If anyone does have any questions or any thoughts and follow up, or any questions, particularly around the risk assessment, because that's really quite a central document to all of this, obviously do get in touch with us. And as I said at the beginning, if you've got any suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover, please do let us know. And otherwise, just thanks again for joining, and we'll see you on the next one.